Right then, so I just want to briefly explain what I think's going on with the with all this GB News, Ofcom, Jacob Rees-Mogg, and all these court cases, and all the kind of arguments and disputes that have been made about, Nigel Farage and Lee Anderson and the Reform UK. So we've got this company, right, called Ofcom. Okay, so that's, if this is Ofcom here in the diagram, right, it is a new body which has been set up by the government, created by the government. It's like, I think it's one of these non-departmental government agencies, like the Advertising Standards Authority and so forth. Now, Ofcom are meant to deal with complaints, obviously, because Parliament can't deal with every complaint. There's too many complaints, so they've set up a separate body to deal with complaints. Obviously, you've got a hierarchy as well, like the Ombudsman and so forth. And you've got like the Legal Ombudsman, you've got the Solicitors Regulation Authority, the Bar Standards Board, all these different type of agencies that are meant to regulate and deal with complaints. So Ofcom here deals with things like the internet and television, right? Everyone can pretty much understand that. Now, the issue is that we've got law, right? So the law is written. So here I'm just drawing a little example to represent acts of law, right? Now, some of these acts of law have law not just for television programs that might break the law, do something that's illegal, or Advertising Standards Authority might have something to do with something that is damaging, and so forth. Part of Ofcom, right, deals with programs like GB News, okay, but GB News is only one of the programs. So Ofcom regulate these programs here, right? Now, some of the programs, not all of them, but some of them, right? GB News. So that, if that's GB News there. Now, Ofcom regulates GB News. There's no doubt about that. And GB News has some it started to have politicians on there. Okay, so it's touching on political matters because it's got people who are going to be politicians, or people who are politicians, members of parliament, or they've been in elections, right? Now, some of these laws here are in the Ofcom policy. The Ofcom policy is taking into account some of the law, but the policy that Ofcom have got, right, unfortunately, is not actually including all of the law which governs these MPs, right? it's actually only having in its actual policy, it's only got in its policy some of the law that it really should be enforcing and that does apply to these MPs here when they're actually on TV, right? So it's actually ignoring some of the law. It's ignoring some of the law. And that is what the problem is, right? And the government created Ofcom. The government invented Ofcom and set up its policy, right? But its policy is actually flawed because it's not making account for all of this legislation which does apply and does actually apply to the things that Ofcom's governing, which is GB News, right? So when GB News is being governed by Ofcom, it's meant to govern Ofcom. Ofcom is not governing it with all of the law, right? When it's supposed to, that's what it's there for, right? So this law here, for example, right, is not getting applied, it's not getting through to enforcement. You can see this red line I've got here, right? Moving this red line around. This particular law, because Ofcom ignored it in its policy, but it does apply to these situations, right? It's not actually getting enforced and applied, right? And that's the problem. Now, the thing is that we've got these election laws here. Now, we've also got the police, okay? If that blue box there is the police, right? Now, the police can enforce some of these laws, right? Okay? But when the police enforce some of those laws, it's mainly citizens who break those laws and they just get prosecuted, right? If it's an MP who breaks one of those laws, right, and it gets reported through the police, right, and the MP gets convicted, right, any MP who's convicted of an offence, obviously, when the privileges are applied properly to MPs, because there's a whole argument over MPs' privileges and so forth, right? And them getting prosecuted in Parliament time and not in the session time, right? But effectively, this way of the law getting enforced through the police and not Ofcom, right? Although I think Ofcom are supposed to report things to the police. Ofcom are supposed to report things to the police, but they've taken action themselves. Now, if it's an MP who's broke the law, right, and they get convicted of any offence, really, they're supposed to get reported to the Speaker of Parliament, and they can kind of be removed that way through a recall petition. This is subject to certain privileges rules as well, which aren't being fully taken into account, but that's beyond the scope of this. This is just about Ofcom, right, and GB News and the courts. Now, the police can also be reported this law against normal citizens. So if we've got normal, regular citizens, right, if we've got normal, regular citizens breaking the law, they can be prosecuted. Now, that doesn't... These offences, likely do not affect the election, or they're not contesting the MP seat. They're just crimes to do with elections that people can be prosecuted for. But now this is the thing, right? The courts with this law here, right? Mainly for what MPs can and can't do. If it's the actual MP themselves and not another citizen, which it actually is in the case if they're a presenter, right? If Ofcom are taking action, like we've got here, action, right? The thing is, what's been happening, like with the Culture, Media and Sport Committee and these Ofcom fines against MPs and so forth, is that really these laws, when they're broken and not complied with, what it really is doing is it is challenging the election. If it's one of the candidates, one of the MPs like Farage, Tice or Jacob Rees-Mogg, it actually, that legislation coming into effect and force really should merit an election petition. Now, an election petition is a special prosecution. It's in the High Court, but it challenges the election based on this law when it is one of these people who have committed an offence, right? But it's £5,000, right? For a member of the public has to pay £5,000 and submit an election petition. Now, no one can afford that. No one can afford that election petition money, right? It's too expensive. But this is the thing, right? Ofcom are meant to be governing, really, all of the activity, that any of it that is not lawful, right, on GB News, right? And their policy is meant to uphold the law, but it's ignoring some points of the law. But when it does enforce its policy, like with Jacob Rees-Mogg, what does that really mean? Because they're saying here, there's this law here, and it's against our policy, and therefore we're fining Rees-Mogg. But to initiate a legal action against a candidate, right, which you've got to acknowledge that they're a candidate, right? It's a civil, fining them is a civil case, but they're not bringing an election petition because it's £5,000 to bring an election petition, and 4 members of the public have to sign it. Even the police, when they prosecute certain offences, although you don't need an election petition, if an MP gets charged with any of the other offences and it gets reported to the Speaker, right, it can have a recall thing, so you don't actually really need it if you think about it. But what's actually happening is we're getting Ofcom are using their policy as a means for civil proceedings to fine someone who is actually doing something which is against this election law, but it's not being brought as a breach of the election law under an election petition and the Representation of the People Act. They're actually, what they're doing is they're going to a court, a civil court, right? And what they're doing is they're enforcing this law here, right, through Ofcom, through these persons to a civil court, right? And they're saying, oh, you broke this policy. And these MPs, these defendants are arguing, here, they're arguing human rights issues in the court, like, European human rights, freedom of speech, Mogg argued, against Ofcom's policy, which is here, right? This is Ofcom's policy. But the policy is not acknowledging and accounting for all of this law, which actually makes it that these MPs here aren't even going to be allowed to be on there in the first place because it's illegal, right? And it would render the election a void by an election petition. But they're not having one. They're having legal arguments over this policy here, which is meant to govern online, right? Govern online. Govern online. That means govern the laws of England, which involve being on the internet or on TV, right? Which includes these MPs and includes this law here, which Baron Grade of Yarmouth and the board of Ofcom and the people who made the policy, basically the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee and House of Lords, don't seem to have included it in the policy at all whatsoever. Otherwise, these MPs wouldn't be on there at all. They wouldn't be allowed. And the name Ofcom seems to be quite relevant, right? And what they're doing is having legal challenges in courts over what these people can and can't say or do, yet what they can and can't say or do, being in an election and politicians, really should be being argued in an election petition, right? It should be coming through this legislation into Ofcom, right, against GB News in an election petition, because it involves these persons who are candidates being entertainers and not only just being on there, but what they can and can't say. But they can't. It doesn't matter what they can and can't say because they're not going to be on there at all, right? So this law here is not meant to be contested in normal civil court, right? You've got election crimes, which are criminal offences under some of this law, crimes which the police can either directly be reported to, right? And you go into a criminal court, right? This is a criminal court, and the police go in there, and if they get prosecuted with a crime, right, then that can be reported to Parliament, right? But if it's not a criminal offence, a crime, then it's election petition here, right? And that's for these type of laws which are at all touching on these persons who have to be acknowledged as candidates in an election and members of Parliament, right? There should not be in existence this, right? Which I put a green box around now. That shouldn't exist. Why? Because there are either criminal offences or an election petition, right? Because the election petition is the only way you can have any civil proceedings which touch on these persons here. Because these persons here are standing in elections, and the matters that they're being done with Ofcom for, why do Ofcom have this policy? Why do Ofcom have this policy here? All this impartiality or this or that? It's actually a disguise. What this actually is, this Ofcom policy here, it is a camouflaging and a cover-up of the law which it is actually based on and is meant to be enforcing and using, right? But yet, it's getting transcribed into a policy, and then when you go into court, right, then they just say, oh, this is our policy and these people broke it and we're going to fine them. But the policy is not a law. The policy is representing and based on law, and not all of it. Because this law and these persons in their situation cannot really be challenged in a civil court. Because Rees-Mogg, being a member of Parliament, is privileged, and what he says and does as an MP is privileged, and when he's running an election or anything to do with an election, can only be an election petition. So what Ofcom have invented, right, is in a loophole. It's created a loophole of civil fines and charges which aren't a criminal offence under election law, and don't bring an official election petition which is entitled under the Representation of the People Act, which is this act here, right, which is being ignored and not fully represented in the policy. So you don't get a matter of the representation of the people, and you don't get a criminal charge, because Ofcom have created this fictional policy area where they can do these fines in civil court, yet it's privileged MPs but are also candidates in elections, which is why you have to have an election petition, because previously it was matters that can only be decided in Parliament by petition. But in 1868, they opened it up to the courts, but only by election petition. And they're not bringing criminal charges against Mogg. So if it's any other programme, like Play School, or, if it's, a random YouTube channel, Mr. Beast or whatever, right? You pick a random YouTube channel, right? Likely doesn't have any MPs on there, and it's nothing to do with Parliament, right? But this particular niche here, GB News, with these men and women, Esther McVey, Jacob Rees-Mogg, presenting, being a member of Parliament as well, Mogg, he's maybe privileged anyway, right? They're ending up in a civil court for a policy which is a camouflage cover-up for legislation, and what they've invented is a loophole. So you've got this Judge Collins Rice, right, who's just heard this case in February this year, a couple of months ago, 3 months ago, right, and it's actually an anomaly. What it actually is an anomaly in law. You can't really have Judge Collins Rice in the High Court hearing a case of Jacob Rees-Mogg on GB News because he said this or that, when actually he was a candidate in the election, and what's the point in Ofcom having a policy on what people can and can't say, right? You can't have a civil court case with Rees-Mogg for GB News because it's privileged to an election petition only, or certain criminal offences, right? Which, if he's guilty of those, he gets reported to the Speaker, right? So they're bypassing the actual law so they can facilitate these ridiculous fines, which completely and totally are circumventing the Election Petition and Representation of the People Act, right? Which is a law which Mogg's not even prevents him from even being on GB News, right? Can't even be on there. So Justice Collins shouldn't be hearing a case which involves Jacob Rees-Mogg. Not when he's an MP, or not when he's being a candidate in an election and it has an effect on his election, right? Because he shouldn't be on there in the first place. And that's why that law's not getting mentioned, when even that law, you see, this law that we're talking about, this law here, right? This law here, which I'm drawing over now, right, is the title of this act here. It's in the first two lines of this act, a matter of the representation of the people. And that is the issue with Mogg being on GB News. The issue, right? But instead, they use other legislation and put it into their policy and say, oh, the issue is a different issue, right? But the same person, the same programme, the same circumstances, all the same persons, circumstances and events, right? The same persons, circumstances and events, right? With a absolute complete tosh fine, a tosh fine. An absolute, complete, utter tosh fine. The Ofcom policy fine is it's pure fabrication. Tosh. They invented it. They made it up and said that you can actually have that fine heard in a civil court, right? Which you can't. The High Court case can't freaking exist. It's not legal, right? Because he was committed a criminal offence, which is reported to the police, or it's a matter of the representation of the people, which is 5k, right? And Ofcom are not wanting to save us £5,000 in a matter of the representation of the people, which is what the Mogg case is. Not tosh Ofcom tosh. Pure Ofcom policy tosh. And this is actually what's happening to YouTube. You know, YouTube policy where, you know, you can't get a response from YouTube, you can't get them in court, they never follow through to court. It's this kind of like ethereal castle in the sky policy thing, which is just taking people's material down, imposing punishments on people. It's a corporate Starship Enterprise, which is, you know, going where no man has gone before. This is the civil court case. Mogg is going where no man, no MP has been before, into GB News Entertainment, and where no matter of the representation of the people or criminal offence has been before, into Justice Collins's High Court case, right? When it's a matter of representation of the people, but disguised under Ofcom policy as, oh, we're going to create this thing called a fine, right? Which is absolute tosh. So it actually should be a writ of error to Parliament. And like, you know, what is Justice Collins doing hearing a civil dispute over an MP who happened to be a candidate in an election over a policy whereby it is a matter of the representation of the people or a criminal offence? Cannot be. It can't be a normal civil trial. You can't have a normal civil trial with a member of Parliament with what he does or says because he's privileged, and if he's entertaining, then it's illegal because he's not allowed to be presented as an entertainer, which is a matter of a representation of the people, right? So you can't have the High Court case unless it is a matter of the representation of the people, which it wasn't, because Justice Collins did not even entertain the legislation for the representation of the people. Mogg argued it under European human rights, his freedom of speech, freedom of expression. Yet, Rees-Mogg here, his own freedom of expression, seems to be able to completely compete and defeat all the other candidates in an election, their freedom to a fair election, which is all accounted for under spending. Yet Mogg seems to enlarge himself through GB News, right? All privately funded. You know, does his freedom of expression give himself the right to enlarge himself on private corporate money to the complete and total human rights violation of a fair election, right? Of these other candidates who are not getting enlarged by GB News and being entertainment online. So Rees-Mogg's human rights argument is a demurrer, right? It's like, and that's probably the first time I've ever thought of a good example to use that word. It's called a demurrer, I think, in court, which means it's a point, but not a relevant one to the case. It's a true point, but not relevant to the case, because it's true that Mogg should have freedom of expression, but in the context of an election and why all this law exists and what he's even doing on GB News when he's saying things, because it is to the unfair advantage of other independent candidates who are going to be competing against him in a fair contest, right? His own freedom of expression does not give him the right to cheat, basically, in a competition. So, and this is why, because the Representation of the People Act is not even being acknowledged, because they've created this Never Never Land, just in rights, that court case was illegal. It was unlawful, because you can only challenge, in the circumstances of Mogg being a candidate in an election and previously an MP, you can't have a High Court case. It's either criminal prosecution or on a specific election offence, which gets reported to the Speaker of Parliament if he gets convicted, or an election petition challenging the validity of the election. And the election should be invalid because Mogg cheated, right? And not only Mogg, it's all of Reform UK. And then you got Esther McVeigh, Lee Anderson, Tice, Farage, and there's a word in the Representation of the People Act, a term, which is concerted, right? Concerted. That means different bodies, groups, peoples and parties orchestrating and acting together to cheat, right? So Ofcom, by their policy ignoring some of the laws of the things that it's meant to be supposing to govern on our behalf, they're concerting with the Department of Culture, Media and Sport and the House of Lords with Baron Yarmouth, right? Baron Grade of Yarmouth, and with the government and GB News and the newspapers and media, right? So that's what it actually is. This is textbook crime. It's a concerted plan to try and reclaim the media. And they've even got a political party called Reclaim the Media, but the media was never the politicians to reclaim because they're not allowed on there in the first place. So they're not reclaiming the media. It wasn't theirs to claim in the first place or make use of for entertainment, right? It never was. So, and the word Ofcom, the only thing that's coming that they're trying to get off is this legislation, this law of the Representation of the People Act, 1949, Section 63, 1C. That's what they'd like to come off, disappear off the legislation. And the word, Ofcom, and having all these people on there that aren't meant to be on there in the first place and are supposed to come off, it's actually been named. The naming of it is almost concerted as well. So I'm, being short of £5,000 to bring an election petition, I can only think to bring a writ of error to Parliament, because I do not think that the police, right, are going to act, because I think the police are concerting with them as well. I think the police are concerted, because they should have known the Representation of the People Act and its principles, and they should have taken action against those MPs anyway, unless they didn't because they're privileged. But they don't seem to have a problem prosecuting Dan Norris or Mike Amesbury or other people during Parliament sessions. But this is the thing, the Representation of the People Act is a special process whereby it would have been actually prosecuted by Parliament, and it could be prosecuted against MPs because it would be done by Parliament in Parliament, right? But after 1868, they invented this special thing. That's why it's called an election petition, because it's not like a normal civil or criminal trial. It's called an election petition because it can only be done by petition, but the courts were allowed to do it. So therefore, you can't really have all these fines in the civil court through this Ofcom policy against Mogg, because Mogg's privileged while he's an MP, and he's privileged in the election because you can only it's under the parliamentary law of agency, and you can only have an election petition, right? Which is the whole point, because election petitions have things like certificates of his indemnity, but it proves that, firstly, they shouldn't have been on the TV and they're not allowed on there, and secondly, that the election is void or declared unfair, and these independent candidates have been cheated out of a fair election, right? So that and I know this diagram's ended up being a bit messy, but the issue is this Ofcom policy, and as we find with YouTube, with it's that they're trying to slowly actually kind of get rid of the law and instead replace the law of England with the policy of companies and organisations, and they're just kind of making it up, and they don't even have to get these things. Well, they do. It's made by Parliament, but I don't think it was voted on in Parliament. Maybe the Ofcom policy was, but this Ofcom policy and how they're working is it is actually undermining law, and yet they're claiming to govern everything online. They're claiming to govern everything online. They can't govern Mogg when he's an MP, and they can't govern and they can't bring any action, really, without it either being a criminal offence or an election petition. So I really don't know what they're doing with these High Court cases. It's wrong. And the High Court case was actually illegal. You're actually challenging the case itself and the judge, the conduct of the judge, because you can't have it, because it's contempt, because it can only be an election petition, right? Or certain criminal charges.